Hello everybody, we're back at it again with another campaign book lore video. Continuing the exploration of the section of my homebrew campaign map that I am calling Brimadosa. I have had one specific character on my mind for the last month, and for the last 2.5 weeks I've been drawing the art to go with this character. And I gotta say, I might actually be a little proud of this one. Alright, jumping right in for a little background lesson. Brimadosa is the gothic blood punk vampire core edgelord indulgent city that I'm building because number one, I want to, and it's my book and I can do what I want, and number two, 'tis the season, which I can finally say because it's finally actually starting to feel like it where I live. Because what do you mean I live in the northern hemisphere and it was basically 90 degrees Fahrenheit the first weekend of October? That's crazy. I hate that. But also, if it gets too cold and I have to wear a jacket over my cute sweaters, I'm going to riot. Not sure at what, but if you're enjoying me at 2:37 p.m, I'm gonna try throwing some form of squash at the sun to see if that helps. So like I said, I've been doing some loose brainstorming about Brimadosa and the government structure and the city life and the religions in that area, and I have significantly fewer conclusive thoughts than I wish I had by this time. But I have a little more groundwork on why Brimadosa, a city that is filled to overflowing with magic and talent, with a very capable monarch, is still under the rule of the Empress Madrive. If you're new here, the primary conflict in the campaign I'm building is an uprising in some western cities against the empire called Exnir, which for a millennia has remained relatively peaceful under the rule of the same singular empress. The various cities of the empire work in sort of a federation state. For the most part, they operate pretty independently. They have their own religions, their own smaller governing styles, but they are all required to report to the empress. And for the most part, most of the cities do this pretty willingly. Just because it's worked for years, why would they uproot the system? But because I want to create some interesting dynamics and make neither side of this empire conflict a clear good guy or bad guy to cause some player chaos, I was contemplating making Brimadosa one of the less willing participants. After all, since they have been required by the Empress to maintain a certain level of secrecy and separation from the rest of the world, they don't often get to make the reports about how their section of the country is doing directly to her. And that means they have to work through a middleman from a different city, which in this case is Karados. And I can imagine with the time it takes to travel and the way word of mouth works, that can get pretty frustrating. But the biggest question I had to answer was, why does Brimadosa remain as this subservient vassal state, especially when their leader strikes me as a very independent person? So I turned to history, actual history. A pretty common answer that came back was that these vassals were often in a position where they had to be subservient for a number of reasons. Maybe because of the larger nation's size of military and inability to produce their own goods, and consequently their reliance on the larger nation's trade network. And you know what? All of that makes a lot of sense and works pretty perfectly for Brimadosa. Geographically, Brimadosa is not very centralized and they don't have a lot of great things on their border. They have an insane magic forest that lives by its own laws, a city run by the Empire, and the Akrios Ocean. And you think, oh, maybe they could create strength by way of the sea? Wrong! Their coast is very rocky and jagged with many unfriendly cliffs. It's very dangerous and not great for ships or ports. Plus, around 1,000 years of government pressure has kept them in a perpetual state of isolation, forcing them to rely on the trade routes established by the Empire to keep the people of Brimadosa fed and well cared for. And our monarch is not happy about this. She's who I am drawing today. I said in a previous video I was briefly toying with the idea of having a king of Brimadosa, and here she is. Allow me to introduce you to her. She is King Ienaira Kefara Athanasius. And King Ienaira is working to make Brimadosa an independently functioning country. Also, it's probably just my bias in liking to draw women and my glee at having a woman be the ruler of a territory, but I fear I'm really at the point where I have a very strong imbalance here of the ratio of women in power versus men in power. Oopsie, oh well. In terms of monarchs, King Ienaira is relatively new in her seat on the throne, maybe having ruled about 5 years. She inherited her position from her uncle, who is her last living relative. The throne in Brimadosa has been passed down through lineage for many years, however the Athanasius line is slowly dwindling. A sickness spreads through Brimadosa, seeming to specifically target nobility. Some think that it's a result of genetics, some believe it's a curse for selling their magic relics to be exploited by the Empire, and some believe that the goddess Anatarat is punishing the Athanasius line for not taking their birthright as the children of Anatarat and becoming the highest power in the land. Either way, Ienaira is the last physically able ruler left in the Athanasius line, and the citizens are getting restless. King Ienaira, however, has other plans. She is very distinctly not interested in producing an heir to continue the line, let alone the fact that she is not confident her health would permit it. Rather, she is interested in only living long enough to see Brimidosa get to a self-sufficient state. And after that, she has personal plans to turn over the government from a monarchy to a representative democracy. King Ienaira has spent every waking hour dedicating herself to making Brimidosa safe and self-reliant. She has invested as much of the kingdom's coffers as possible into agriculture, technological advancements, medical studies, and making sure that her citizens have safe work environments. As a byproduct of her paying for citizens to pursue studies in these subjects, there has been a massive rise in education, and talent is no longer going undiscovered. Brimidosa has some of the most skilled students in artificing, hemocraft, and general wizardry. However, since Brimidosa is so isolated, the potential of those students is often bottlenecked by the resources within the territory, and very few Brimidosans are able to find an opportunity that allows them to leave. And so, in the last few years of making the mining processes safer, increasing education, learning how to grow their own food in their non-optimal conditions, and having some insane medical advancements, our king is moving on to the next stage of her plan, establishing her own trade routes and connections out of Brimidosa without the Empire finding out. Maybe it's just trade routes by foot, maybe she's secretly building airships, maybe she's made an alliance with a nearby neutral country. I don't know, but these are all sort of little fun things that could draw players in by methods other than having to get into Brimidosa by way of Exenerian trade routes. Eventually, Ienaira's goal is to fully detach from Exener. She no longer wants to be required to relinquish magic relics to the Empire. She wants her people to profit directly from the goods that they produce. However, she isn't confident that this is something that is going to be done in her lifetime, and she isn't sure how to do this without incurring the wrath of the Empire as a whole. When I design something, when I plan something for my campaign book, I try to make the sections of the map have either a cool way for the player character to build their backstory or an interesting piece of conflict for players to change the outcome of. And I think Brimidosa provides a lot of both. And maybe the Empire starts getting the sense that Brimidosa is trying to gain independence and a military force starts moving in. Maybe a player discovers one of the secret trade routes that Brimidosa is trying to establish and finds an interesting way to buy new magic items. Maybe a player is from Brimidosa, a sheltered individual experiencing the fullness and diversity of the continent for the first time. And I just think that's neat. Alright, so I've done a lot of talking about lore and goals and conflicts, but believe it or not, this is an art channel, not just me info dumping my made up lore on you guys, so let's talk a little bit about the design process. It feels like it's been a long time since I've drawn a character within a scene. It's not really something I like to do because I greatly prefer working on character design, and I feel like that shows in my work. I get really fixated on certain parts of a drawing and then ignore other parts, and it tends to feel patchy and incomplete. Even with this drawing, I don't think I quite have the hang of working on a character within a scene. That being said, I can say fairly conclusively that I have improved a lot, and I do feel pretty proud of the final render. Something that definitely helped was focusing on the values first and then adding a gradient map to sort of establish the tones of the warm colors. I'm gonna be honest, I'm still not sure that I'm using a gradient map quite right, but go easy on me. I am excruciatingly self-taught. I know nothing about how art things should or shouldn't work. With my gradient map, I mostly was putting in reds and dark blues, and wherever I wanted a little more variation in colors, I added those using multiply, color dodge, and soft light layers. That way I wasn't changing all of those values that I worked so hard to put in. It's a little tricky to figure out how colors translate when doing them in filter layers, but with a bit of trial and error, I managed to get things to actually kind of work for me. Another thing that helped massively was actually giving myself the luxury of stopping when I felt burnt out to go work on a different project. I was watching a video from an artist who makes the splash art for League of Legends, and she was saying it takes several weeks for her to get from the starting ideas phase to a final splash art. And since that's her job, assuming a regular 40-hour-a-week schedule, that could be 80, that could be 120 hours, that could be even more because freelance kind of works like that. And I've just never given myself that kind of time to work on a digital art piece. So I intentionally worked on this piece in shorter bursts over the course of a longer period of time. And also whenever I felt like the piece was done or I didn't know what to add next, I would walk away and then come back when I felt refreshed to push myself to find more things to work on. And believe it or not, I did always find more things that I could work on. Who could have guessed that not burning yourself out and also intentionally giving yourself time to work while not under pressure gives really good results? Who could have seen that coming? And one last thing before I run out of time, I have to mention this. In terms of design, the two things that inspired me the most for this piece were, number one, the very specific visual of sunlight shining through a pomegranate seed, which I know is just so specific. And number two, of course, my beloved childhood favorite, honestly still my favorite, the icon, the legend, Queen Amidala. The extravagance of her hair, the high colors, the metalwork, it was an absolute must for this character. But on that note, that is the end of this video and the lore dump and the drawing. I know I say it every time trying to sound positive, but I really am proud of this piece. I mean, let's just take a quick look at how far I've come since I drew the Empress. I made this piece like 3 years ago, and this took me a really long time, and I really want to go back and rework this original piece. The Empress is so central to the story, and I feel like she needs to at least have some planes and shadows in her face. Would you guys watch that? Would you guys watch if I went back and fixed some of my old art that I made on this channel? Let me know, I guess. Genuinely though, all hail King Ienaira, Kefara, Athanasius, long may she reign. I love this character concept, and I'm really excited to continue fleshing out Brimidosa and the rest of this campaign book. And of course, on top of that, thank you guys so much for watching and just indulging me in my silly little campaign building endeavors. Stay spooky. Hope to see you next time while we continue to explore the secrets of Brimidosa. Or depending on how I feel, somewhere else entirely. But who knows? Not me.